Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English, and we turn now to our study of Odyssey 11. Many have argued the heart of the Odyssey, the kingdom of the dead, the journey to the underworld, the Hades. It might be the most important book of the Odyssey. It certainly is going to play around with notions of afterlife. We're going to marry this to our study of Plato's Republic, Book 10 later. Certainly, this notion of what happens after you die is understood in multiple ways. Sometimes the view is that nothing happens after you die. There's a linear view that says you live, you die, you've got some kind of reward, punishment. And then there's a cyclical view that says you come back. We've got a little bit of all of that in Homer, and as we look at it, I'll let you decide kind of how that one plays out. Of course, St. Augustine studied well the Odyssey and knew very much about the fact that in the Bible, the notion of what happens when you die in the afterlife is a little bit fuzzy. We have some very concrete ideas here that will be presented that obviously Augustine was aware of. We're going to have Virgil's Aeneas, who will take a similar trip to the underworld in Book 6. Dante's Inferno we'll be studying together. We'll think of the great existentialist play Sartre's No Exit, playing the same kind of game. Now, really quickly, if you haven't been following our lectures, make sure you're at learnstrong.net in the AP folder. Let's just go through the 10 books we've already covered. Book 1, of course, the Invocation of the Muse, and we're in Ithaca with Athena, and of course, Telemachus is given his mission to go and find info about his dad. Book 2, Telemachus tries to call the assembly and is kind of not so good at it, and leaves to go with Mentor, who is, of course, Athena, in search of intel. In Book 3, we have Telemachus with Nestor. Ultimately, Nestor's boy and he will leave. Book 4, we have Telemachus with Menelaus and Helen. She and Menelaus both telling stories. In Book 5, we have Odysseus. Finally, we're seeing him for the first time on Calypso's island. And, of course, he's allowed to leave. Book 6, Odysseus will be with Nausicaa. That's going to be significant, by the way. Remember that one, okay? And the interesting conversation between the two of them. Book 7, in the hall of the Phaeacians there, Odysseus as supplicant, especially to Arete. The queen, we're going to talk about that. Book 8, the Phaeacian Games, and Demodocus, the great poet. We're going to come back to that as well. In many ways, Book 11 assumes everything that comes before. In Book 9, the story begins, the flashbacks begin, and we've got the city of the Cicones attacked, the land of the Lotus Eaters, and of course the famous story of Polyphemus, the one-eyed giant, who of course curses Odysseus because his dad is Polyphemus. In Book 10 we have Aeolus and the wind, we have the Laestrygonians, the cannibals, who will ultimately kill all but one ship of Odysseus' men, and finally 1 year with Circe. Now, again, the hope is that you're reading and then letting me help you out. Our learning theory, again, to connect new to old. And remember, in our reading theory at 2B, we're looking at symbol and irony. And at level 3, we're looking at references to the Iliad. That's going to be huge for us because in this, we will return to the Iliad. Now, before we consider, before we begin, consider a few things. We call this the journey to the dead, the Nequia, which just is the Greek word that references death. And this is a hallmark of heroes. I mean, we have all kinds of people. Theseus, who's mentioned on line 365 of this book, Hercules, Orpheus, Gilgamesh, who of course we've talked about, mentioned before, Aeneas, Dante's Pilgrim. Think of it, even Christ and Lazarus in the New Testament both have some experience with the afterlife. The other thing I would point out is that in the 20th century, comrades Marlowe and Heart of Darkness and Sarda mentions No Exit will play into this as well. Now remember, the other thing we want to say is that Odysseus, we're told this, he's an amazingly great liar. So how much of this story is actually true? Who knows, right? There are some scholars that say he pretty much had to have made it all up, of course. Why get into a debate like that? Dude, we're talking about going to where dead people are. There's no reason to debate that, right? Odysseus also is a great rhetorical speaker. He's going to choose his words carefully, his order of words carefully. Why does he, for example, begin in one place and emphasize one thing as opposed to another? All of that's going to be significant. The review, really quickly, we have the initiation with blood, because you can't get into hell without blood. We have, first of all, Elpenor. So Odysseus is going to see a whole bunch of people. Elpenor is one of the really tragic people who falls off of a roof before they leave and dies, and nobody realizes that he didn't come along for the ride and he's dead. Elpenor asks that he be buried. We have Odysseus' mother that shows up, and Odysseus won't talk to her because he wants to talk to Tiresias first. he does, and Tiresias says, whatever you do, don't eat those cattle on the island of the sun god, or all your men will die, and you'll have a long, hard homecoming. And when you do get home, you're going to have all kinds of issues. He then will talk to his mother, and he asks about, of course, Penelope. Think about this. It's at that moment that Nausicaa, who is listening in, of course, realizes, oh, I guess this guy will never be my husband because he's already married, right? We then will have 14 different women who are just quickly listed, and it's a good question. Why does Odysseus start with really famous women? And of course, the answer is because he's trying to impress Laertes, right? Because she's the one that kind of seems to hold the power, even though in the book, this book 11, Alcinous will say that he's the one in charge. You can kind of tell who's in charge. We then will have a break in the story at line 375, and Odysseus says, all right, I'm done, let's go to bed, and I'm ready to leave. And of course, he knows exactly what he's doing, right? They're like, no, we need to know more. Alcinous will in fact say, tell us about the heroes. And so we get stories. Agamemnon's story and the homecoming. Of course, think of it. We know that Agamemnon got jacked when he came home. Odysseus doesn't. This will be the first time for him, right? And Agamemnon will give his famous line at 5:18, the time for trusting women is gone. Pretty brutal line. He then meets with Achilles. Achilles says, I hate this place and I could care less about all of the Kleos that I won while I was alive. Along with Achilles is Patroclus and Antilochus, Nestor's boy, but we don't get any conversation with them. Achilles does ask, by the way, about his father and his son, and Odysseus gives him some good information about at least his son. The greater Ajax, or Ajax, as he was referred to in the Iliad, won't talk to Odysseus because, of course, he committed suicide over a fight regarding Achilles' armor, and Odysseus won the armor, and he won't talk to him. We finish with Minos, Orion, Titus, Tantalus, and Sisyphus. Both are interesting characters. We'll talk a little about them. And then finally, he finishes his story with Hercules. And Hercules will in fact say, you're just like me, we're kind of brothers. And of course Odysseus has reasons maybe to equate himself with Hercules. Alright, let's go ahead and go to the key lines. I gotta be honest, I would love, if I had time, to read this entire, I mean, you talk about great storytelling. You got Homer having Odysseus tell a story. It's phenomenal, it's phenomenal. This is in many ways, as we said, the heart of the Odyssey. It's backward looking, it's forward looking. It's the pivotal, it's the fulcrum to the entire poem itself. And in many ways, scholars have pointed out that Odysseus is in many ways kind of born and reborn, right, through this whole project. Well, let's go ahead quickly and take a look at it. And we begin with the words, now, down we came to the ships. And we'll reference these lines when we get to the opening lines of Plato's Republic. I went down to the Piraeus. So down, he says, we go. There's lots and lots of crying. Circe's going to give them a good wind to get them off. They go. When they finally get there to the underworld, the house of the dead, they build a trench. They pour libations of different kinds. They have milk. They got honey. They got wine. Then they sprinkle barley. Then finally, you gotta make the promise of a sacrifice upon return to Ithaca, and then finally you got the blood. The blood, of course, is referencing, symbolizing life, right? And then we're back to the to referencing of the Iliad, because we're told that all kinds of ghosts start coming out, right? Great armies of battle dead, stabbed by bronze spears, men of war still wrapped in bloody armor, thousands swarming round the trench from every side, unearthly cries, blanching terror gripped me. And this is one of those things, and in Fegel's translation, even at this line, at line 47, there's an exclamation point, which obviously, it doesn't get used a lot in the translation. In other words, this is kind of really, really scary. By the way, he draws his sword to keep all these ghosts away. I'm not sure what good swords will do. You'll remember, or when we study at Hamlet at the beginning of the play, Laertes or Horatio will in fact try and stab at the ghost, and you can't stab it. I mean, there's no way. Okay, let's go ahead and go through these quickly, and I am going to work through these quickly in your notes, and we'll say a few things and we'll read a few lines. We first have the story of Elpenor. It's a really tragic story. He went up drunk, he went up on the roof to sleep, he falls off and breaks his neck. By the way, for those of you who know your book of Acts in the New Testament, 20 verse 9, we have a similar kind of story where Paul is speaking and somebody goes to sleep and falls out the window and dies. Elpenor's request is, make sure you bury me and remember me. I want some kleos, in other words. And this notion of remember me at line 80, later we'll meet a poem by Thomas Hardy that's called Are You Digging on My Grave? And I'll just remind you that we come back to this notion of being remembered after somebody dies, how well that happens. Then finally he sees his mother, and think about the power of this. He doesn't know his mother's dead. And then all of a sudden he's like, Ma, what are you doing down here? But she wants to come up and drink the blood and talk to him. He won't let her because he's got to talk to Tiresias first. Let's put it in our notes. Odysseus is a very driven man. I mean, he's going to get what he wants, and what he wants is that conversation, right? Tiresias does show up. The instructions happen. Poseidon, he says, will jack you. He says, you're going to have to make sure your men curb their desire, line 118, their wild desire, and curb your own. What's more, from the day your good trim vessels puts in at the island of Helios, the sun god, make sure you don't touch the beast. Leave the beasts unharmed. Of course, this is going to be the end of it. He says, if you don't, you're going to have some serious problems, even if you escape, at line 130. You're going to come home late and a broken man. By the way, this is all going to be the prophecy that Polyphemus made, right, when he called out to his daddy. Alone in a stranger ship, that will be the Phaeacians. And you're going to have a bad homecoming. He says it, though, no doubt, you will pay the suitors back in blood when you come home. So, in other words, we know what's coming, right? But, finally, this is really interesting. Once you've killed the suitors in your halls, go forth once more, you must. In other words, you're going to have one more journey after you're done. Carry your well-planed oar until you come to a race of people who know nothing of the sea, whose food is never seasoned with salt, strangers all to ships with their crimson pearls. In other words, he says, I want you to take your oar and start walking inland until finally you meet somebody that doesn't even have a clue what it is. In other words, they're completely landlocked. They got no idea what an oar is. At that point, that's your sign. And he says, make a sacrifice to Poseidon. And he says, after you do this, at last, at line 155, your own death will steal upon you. A gentle, painless death. We're going to say this at the end of the Odyssey. There is no death narrative for Odysseus. Far from the sea it comes to take you down, borne down with the years and ripe old age, with all your people there in blessed peace around you. The quest of all heroes is to either die in the battle, we think of Achilles at the walls of Troy, or a quiet death for Odysseus. But we'll never have it recorded, right? He asks, what's up with my mom? Tiresias says if she drinks the blood, she can talk. And now we have this conversation with mom. And she will say, oh, my son, what brings you down to the world of death and darkness? You are still alive. It's hard for the living to catch a glimpse of this. That's an important line because, of course, Odysseus is telling the people he's telling the story to, not everybody gets to do what I did. And, of course, Odysseus is the only one there, for there's no one else to corroborate whether, in fact, this is true or not, right? She asks, why didn't you come home? And Odysseus will say it, I'm a wanderer, harking back to the book 1 opening, right? And then he will ask several questions in this order. He asks about dad, he asks about his throne, he asks about his wife, he asks about his son. Of course, the moment he asks about his wife, obviously Nausicaa realizes, the guy I thought I was going to marry, he's already married. Mother will answer in reverse order. So she will begin with Penelope and the boy. She will say, everybody's waiting for you and everybody's fine. Dad is a loner who lives all by himself, refuses to come into town. She says about herself, I died of grief over your not coming home. Think about the power of that. Odysseus not only realizes that his mother is dead, but that he is the cause of that death somehow because she was so sad about him never coming home. The name Odysseus, we're going to find out later in the Odyssey in 19, is actually about causing pain, causing suffering, and certainly it happened here, right? He tries to hug her, and he can't. You can't hug it, you can't touch, right? She says, remember to tell Penelope everything. Now, the next part of the Odyssey in the story is 14 famous women that will be one right after the other. I don't have time to go through all of them. We've got Tyro at lines 270. I'll just do this quickly. You have Antipe at line 295 or so. By the way, one of the things that makes these women amazing, especially the first three, is that they slept with gods and therefore produced amazing children, often twins. Alcmena is the next one. Megara is the next one. Jacusta or Hephaestus is the way that it's given in the Odyssey. But Oedipus's wife, mother, and of course the fact that she hanged herself and all of that. Chalorus is there. Again, it's always about sons in this passage at 320, and dads and daughters, and we're immediately reminded of the idea that, of course, we have a lot of different relationships between dads and daughters. At line 340, we've got, he meets Leda, Iphamida at line 350, and then Phaedra, Proclus, and Ariadne he meets. And then to just finish it off, he meets Clymene, he meets Mara, and Eurypyle. All of those are the 14 that he meets. And he just goes one right after the other, and he makes comments about each one. He then will pause, and he says, but the whole cortege I could never tally, never name. In other words, he said, I saw a lot more than this at line 373. All the daughters and wives of great men I saw there. By the way, why would we begin with daughters and wives? Well, he's talking, of course, to Arete, and of course, Nausicaa is there, right? In other words, let's put it in our notes. Odysseus knows why he's choosing the stuff he's choosing to talk about, right? It's brilliant. But the time has come, he says, for sleep, either with friends aboard or your swift ship or here in your own house. My passage home will rest with the gods and you. In other words, Odysseus pauses, and he says, okay, I've told you enough. That's my story, let me leave. And you can kind of get a sense that we got several things happening simultaneously. We got Homer, who is of course going to take a little bit of a pause to remind us that we are in the middle of a story that Odysseus is telling. Of course, Homer is complete control of his narrative technique here. I'm going to take a little break and let everybody catch their breath. Of course, we're also going to need a little bit of a breather to kind of orient where we are. When we pick up Conrad's Heart of Darkness, when Marlowe tells his story about going into the heart of Africa to find Kurtz, he'll do this same thing, where he pauses for a moment and he brings us back to where we are, and then we go back into the story again. Of course, the other thing is he knows exactly what he's doing. He hasn't told about any of the men that he met down there, and obviously they're going to be very interested in the heroes that were met down there. Aertes will actually be the first one to speak. Odysseus pauses, by the way, at line 378. They all fell silent, hushed, his story holding them spellbound down the shallowed halls, till the white-armed Queen Aertes suddenly burst out. Phaeacians, how does this man impress you now? His looks, his build, the balanced mind, it always comes back to knows. Inside him, the stranger is my guest. It's interesting that she calls him that, right? And give him time. You're going to give him a lot of Scooby snacks. You get the sense that Odysseus, following in the line of Demodocus the bard from earlier, he realizes the better the story, the more the gifts, right? The more the Scooby snacks, the time, right? We then have the old Reverend Alcinous that will say the same thing. Alcinous will be the one that takes over, and he says, I hold the reins of power in this realm at line 400. He says, it's time for us to say to Odysseus to continue. And Odysseus says, I would actually stay here for a whole year. We think of his staying with Circe for a whole year. He said, I'd gladly have it. And then Alcinous will say, Ah, Odysseus at line 411, one look at you and we know that you are no one who would cheat us. No fraud. Now the ironies run deep, because of course Odysseus will cheat anybody to get what he wants. And here Alcinous is like, they're so innocent, the Phaeacians, they don't understand that taking Odysseus home is ultimately going to jack them, right? It's beautiful in their innocence. And of course the question of all questions. He says it, the night's still young. I'd say the night is endless for us in the palace now. It's hardly time for sleep. Keep telling us your adventures. They're wonderful. I could hold out here till dawn's first light. He says, if only you could bear here in our walls to tell the tale of all the pains you suffered. Of course, it's fascinating because here Odysseus is not actually telling just about pains, but also some interesting conversations and possibly even joys, right? So he resumes, and the story resumes at line 430 or so, and he says it. Alcinous Majesty, he says, there is a time for many words, a time for sleep as well, echoing our reading of Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8, right? But if you insist on hearing me, he says, I'll keep going, and sure enough, he does. He says, I'll even tell you about one vicious woman's will. Well, we're talking obviously about Clytemnestra, right? So then we're told that the next hero that he meets, and now we're going to have the heroes of the Trojan War, he meets Agamemnon. Now this is an amazing exchange for a number of reasons. Odysseus left the walls of Troy with Agamemnon alive. He's got no idea that Agamemnon is dead, right? None at all. Now of course we know, and this is a brilliant example of how we know stuff that that obviously Odysseus, a character in the poem, does not know. And Odysseus will ask him, dude, what are you doing here? And how did you die? And Agamemnon's story will of course come back to women bashing. He will begin at line 460 by saying he was mowed down by Aegisthus, Aegisthus hatched my doom and my destruction. He killed me, he with my own accursed wife. He invited me to his palace, set me down to feast, cut me down as a man cuts down some ox at the trough. Now let's pause for a moment in our notes and point out that the killing of people while they're eating is exactly what Odysseus is going to do when he goes back to Ithaca. That is to say, to the suitors. We've already heard it. Tiresias already said it out loud. You're going to go home and spill all their blood. He says, I died a wretched, ignominious death. Around me, all my comrades killed. They're all, by the way, standing around him. No mercy, one after another, just like white-tusked boars, butchered in some rich lord of Power's halls for a wedding. Let's point out, this language is going to sound very familiar at the end of the poem when Odysseus jacks all those cedars. In fact, we're told that there were hundreds. He says it. You've seen hundreds slaughters. He said it would have wrenched your heart. And he says it would have even more broken your heart with the death cry of Cassandra, Priam's daughter, the most pitiful thing I heard. Now what's fascinating is that, Clytemnestra will kill her husband because her husband sacrificed his own daughter Iphigenia. Notice here, he says something about Cassandra and completely nothing about the fact that he killed his own daughter. It is a brilliant kind of irony. Right? And in the end, maybe it is the case that, he gets what he deserves, right? He calls her a whore in line 480. She even lacked the heart, he says, to seal my eyes and close my jaws. In other words, she killed me and just walked away, right? And then he says it. You got to beware of women. He says there's nothing more deadly, bestial than a woman set on works like these. And of course, this is that whole notion in the patriarchy that you got to be suspicious of women. He says from this moment on, all women were cursed at line 490 because of this queen hell-bent on outrage, bathed in shame not only herself but the whole breed of womankind. In other words, because of one bad woman, women lots and lots. And Odysseus will cry out and he says, how terrible, right? Agamemnon cries out, how terrible. He says, Zeus's truest weapon is women's twisted wiles. Now, we think about the weaving that's been happening all the way through this poem, especially as it relates to women. What armies of us died for the sake of Helen? And so here we are, we're back blaming Helen for everything. Clytemnestra